we're talking about the film Reds, of course, like I said. Reds was released at the end of 1981. It was produced and directed by Warren Beatty, who also starred in the film. It tells the true story of the relationship between leftist journalist John Reed, who's played by Beatty, and Louise Bryant, who's played by the amazing Diane Keaton. So in 1915, they met in their native Portland, Oregon. Reed was already by then a well-known journalist and war correspondent who covered the Mexican Revolution and World War I, and also the radical labor movement in the US. Bryant, who was married at the time, and Reed began a scandalous affair at that time, and then they moved to New York together. Eventually they were married themselves, and then the whole reason we're talking about them right now is they traveled to Russia in 1917 to report on the October Revolution as it unfolded. The experience radicalized them even more than they already were, and they both committed themselves to the communist cause for the rest of their tragically short lives. Now, they both wrote books about their experiences. Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World and Bryant's 6 Red Months in Russia still hold up as essential documents of the revolution. And this is especially because their writing really showcases this knack for this kind of vivid street level detail and placing themselves in the action at great personal risk. So I like these two images because it's the real ones, and Beatty and Keaton. And so I just want to, I love this picture of Bryant. She's such a badass. This is from 1918. And I just want to begin by sharing a clip. Now this is in 1920, about 2/3 of the way through the film, set in Russia and during the Civil War, and Reed and his longtime friend, famed anarchist Emma Goldman, are discussing the current state of things. And Emma is played by Maureen Stapleton, by the way.
Jack, I think we have to face it. The dream that we had is dying in Russia. If Bolshevism means the peasants taking the land, the workers taking the factories, Russia's one place where there's no Bolshevism.
You know, I can argue with cops, I can fight with generals. I can't deal with a bureaucrat.
You think, Zinoviev, there's nothing worse than a bureaucrat? The Soviets have no more local autonomy. The central state has all the power. All the power is in the hands of a few men, and they are destroying the revolution. They are destroying any hope of real communism in Russia. They're putting people like me in jail. My understanding of revolution is not a continual extermination of political dissenters, and I want no part of it. Every single newspaper's been shut down or taken over by the party. Anyone even vaguely suspected of being a counter-revolutionary can be taken out and shot without a trial. Where does that end? Is any nightmare justifiable in the name of defense against counter-revolution? The dream may be dying in Russia, but I'm not. It may take some time. I'm getting out.
You sound like you're a little confused by the revolution in action, E.G. Up to now, you've only dealt with it in theory. What did you think this thing was going to be? A revolution by consensus, where we all sat down and agreed over a cup of coffee?
Nothing works. 4 million people died last year, not from fighting a war. They died from starvation and typhus in a militaristic police state that suppresses freedom and human rights where nothing works.
They died because of a French, British, and American blockade that cut off all food and medical supplies, and because counter-revolutionaries have sabotaged the factories and the railroads and the telephones, and because the people, the poor, ignorant, superstitious, illiterate people, are trying to run things themselves, just as you always said that they should, but they don't know how to run them yet. Did you really think things were going to work right away? Did you really expect social transformation to be anything other than a murderous process? It's a war, E.G., and we got to fight it like we fight a war with discipline, with terror, with firing squads, or we just give it up.
Okay, I thought you guys would appreciate this because you're having such a headache with anarchists lately. But to me, the scene really shows how this film is unusually true to the revolutionary politics it depicts, and it's also unusually detailed and nuanced. Because this is Hollywood, you might expect that this is where Reed would begin questioning things and would start to come to the conclusion that he was caught up in something bad or tragic or foolish. In other words, that it would reinforce liberal ideology, and specifically liberal capitalist ideology. You'd be right to expect that because so many films about radical politics take that route exactly. But I was so surprised when I sat down to watch Reds, and it was only 3 years ago, and this turned out not to be the case. As you can see, from the scene in which the hero is making a case for the Red Terror. And after this exchange with Emma Goldman, as opposed to regretting what he just said, the next thing we see is him marching into Grigory Zinoviev's office and tearing up his resignation letter. He had been planning on resigning from the party before this due to his disagreements with the Comintern about these rather heavy-handed decisions they'd made about the formation of the Communist Party in the USA. But it's this conversation about the Red Terror that actually strengthens his resolve, and he makes the decision to subsume his individual or factional gripes with the party and let the collective good rule. And I'm just included this slide of Jerzy Kosinski playing Zinoviev and eating an onion to fight off scurvy, which I just love that scene. And this, all this really inverts the formula. What you get usually in Western depictions of the revolution is this sort of murkiness or this sort of moral quagmire, if not the idea that it was only made up of terror and authoritarianism. But Reds, though it's nuanced enough to discuss that terror, it also unabashedly depicts the revolution as exciting and daring and heroic as another film might depict the American Revolution or the invasion of Normandy. And this is all actually really surprising because Beatty himself is by no means any kind of a Marxist. He was and he remains a staunch Democrat who did fundraising for the party even as a young actor. Obviously this film was released by a major Hollywood studio early in the Reagan era and with the Cold War still in full swing. And it was a big critical and commercial hit. It was nominated for what was then a record 12 Oscars, and Beatty ended up winning Best Director, and also Maureen Stapleton Best Supporting Actress for playing Emma Goldman. It's a safe bet that most people who packed theaters and all the critics and all the Academy members weren't socialists themselves. Amazingly, Ronald Reagan himself liked the film when Beatty screened it for him at the White House, except that he said he only wished it had a happy ending, which is just so amazing and so in character for Reagan. So what was it about Beatty and this project? True, he was unusually honest and brave, taking on such a daring leftist project, but you also have to consider the social context. The radical movements which upended American society in the 1960s at the time also influenced the more experimental and daring school of American filmmaking in the late 60s and 70s, known as the New Hollywood. Films came along that were more transgressive or shocking or questioned the establishment. They featured better roles for women and Black actors, although there's still a lot of work to be done on that, of course. They questioned the war in Vietnam, for example, things that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Beatty was actually a key figure in this movement. He produced and starred in Bonnie and Clyde in 1967, and that's a film that really broke it open with its shocking violence and its anti-establishment themes, showing the criminals as the good guys. It was a huge hit, and it kind of changed the terrain. But when you get to the other end of the 70s, Reds was in some ways the last hurrah of this movement. In the 80s, you had the rise of the summer blockbuster and other genres that were a lot safer and less daring than this school of filmmaking. That was coupled with the whole Reagan era reactionary backlash against the counterculture. And for a lot of overlapping reasons, including the rise of neoliberalism, the capitulation of the organized left in the 70s, there was this broad cultural withdrawal from the radical ideas of the Vietnam era. I'm just using Jane Fonda to illustrate. So Reds was this weirdly pro-communist Hollywood feature film. This kind of outlier at the end of this period of cultural rebellion before it was finally quashed. Beatty has said that he was interested in making a film about Reed as early as 1966. And over time, it became his passion project, even while he was producing and starring in massive comedy hits like Shampoo and Heaven Can Wait. In the mid-70s, these films gave him the power in Hollywood to make his passion project on his own terms. So that's how he kind of foisted this communist epic on Paramount Pictures. And somehow the studio agreed that they would have no input in the screenplay, which just amazes me. So in 1969, Beatty visited the Soviet Union. And he had taught himself some Russian, by the way, and he gained more inspiration there. And I just want to share this encounter that he had. I'm going to skip forward a little bit. I asked the Soviet authorities, can I talk to some people who might have known Reed? And they said there was this woman who claims to have had an affair with him. And I said, can I meet her? And they took me out to her apartment on the 7th floor of one of these temporary looking post-war buildings. She was about 80. Her mother was close to Lenin's wife. And there was a picture of her at the age of 15, an incredibly beautiful little girl standing next to Lenin. I said, did you have a romance with John Reed? She said to me in Russian, a romance? I fucked him. I said, were you ever in a labor camp? And she said, oh, yes. I said, how long were you there? And she said, oh, 16 years. And I said, how do you feel about Stalin? And she said, only hate. But of course, the revolution is in its early stages. And it was at that moment I thought, I have to make a movie about that kind of passion. Now, I don't even know if Beatty, being a liberal, would have had a grasp of the concept of permanent revolution, which like this woman was trying to explain to him. But I think what he says is the key to his approach, which allowed him to suspend his own liberalism, as it were, and approach the history a bit more honestly and immersively than others would have. By all accounts, he really identified with Reed. And it's like he saw Reed's politics for what they were, and he just wanted to communicate them accurately. And you know, it's like you can imagine some horrible Aaron Sorkin-like take on it where it's just completely mangled. Now, he'd been fiddling with the screenplay for years, since the early 70s, but to help him write the film in earnest, he sought out Trevor Griffiths. Now, Trevor Griffiths is an English playwright who happens to be a Marxist. And I don't know a lot about his work. I haven't read any of it, but just a Wikipedia level glance, I saw he wrote a play about Gramsci called Occupations. He wrote a play called The Party about Scottish Trotskyist John Clegg, and he wrote the episode for the BBC series The Fall of Eagles about Lenin and Trotsky, and you may have heard of this because Patrick Stewart plays Lenin. So it seems like his politics might actually be all right, and he definitely left his imprint on this film. So production on the film took a whole year in 1979. Apparently it was a nightmare. Beatty was obsessive to kind of like a historic degree. Like he shot a record millions of feet of film. No one had ever shot that much film. The budget ballooned completely out of control. Beatty fought off the studio relentlessly. You know, when they tried to intervene, he broke Jack Nicholson down in tears at one point, demanding, you know, like 80 takes from him or something like that. Just to make the whole point that nobody could ever do this again. This was just kind of like a one-shot deal and kind of a miracle. And so the early scenes of the film, the first hour, are all about the romance between Reed and Bryant and this community of artists and intellectuals, including Goldman and the radical publisher Max Eastman and playwright Eugene O'Neill, who's played by Nicholson. And there's some mushy stuff with this love triangle between the three, and I don't blame comrades if they want to skip this part. I really enjoy this part. I won't spend too long on all this, but I just want to say that I think these scenes actually serve the politics of the film because they're so human and relatable and even funny. There's so much more than the usual stiffness of a biopic, which is so standard. And it's that extra humanity that really makes the radicalization so much more vivid and relatable when it finally comes in the second half of the film. Now, the political focus of these early scenes is more about bohemianism and free love, and also feminism, particularly in dealing with Bryant's growth as a feminist and a writer. In these early scenes, she's almost like the main character. And one thing about the second, more revolutionary half of the film is that she's actually kind of marginalized compared to Reed, and that's a real shame because her real life story was so interesting and her writing is so good. And she was right there, and you know, there's just this dynamic where she's kind of looking at Reed while he makes speeches, and I think that also has the effect of kind of sidelining women's contribution to the Russian Revolution. It's pretty much only women that you see in the background as extras. You know, they show them, but they're just a little marginalized, and that's a little bit of a shame. Also covered in this first hour is whether the U.S. will enter World War I. Reed supports Woodrow Wilson's candidacy for president, though he loathes the Democrats, but he's convinced that Wilson will keep the US out of the war. And this is just so hilariously exactly the same kind of dynamic we have now with the Democrats and with reformism. And it's like literally nothing has changed in 100 years. Okay, so halfway through the film, Reed and Bryant journey to Petrograd and Russia to cover the revolution just before October, and that's when things get really interesting. By the way, I think they filmed these scenes in Finland. The October Revolution, the insurrection itself, happens in a montage. The Internationale is playing and the Winter Palace is being stormed, and it all goes by really quick. There's just brief glimpses of our boys Lenin and Trotsky. This may be disappointing. You know, you may find yourself wishing that everything covered in the montage was the subject of another entire film itself, or maybe like a miniseries on Netflix. But one thing about the montage is that it shows exactly where the film's heart lies. in the way that it's so heroic. And it signals this by including scenes of Reed and Bryant making love along with the revolutionary stuff. And, in other words, conflating romance and revolution. And there's these shots like this where, stuff is happening and they're beaming at each other, which is ridiculous. It's cliched, I admit all that, but I also don't mind it either. It's Hollywood form, but it's, that form applied in a positive way to socialist revolution, which is just cool. I just want to share this article, this review of the film from Workers' Vanguard, when the film came out in December of 1981. That's the Spartacist League newspaper. You have to scroll past a really awful take on solidarity in Poland to get to this quite good review of the film. We have become used to the anti-communist distortions and primitive class prejudice that characterize Hollywood's product, stupidity and massive disregard of historical truth, unerring ability to get the politics wrong in the service of ideology. We do not expect Hollywood movies to realistically present meetings of militant workers and socialists, nor to characterize political confrontations fairly in tone and substance, or movies peopled by recognizably serious socialists. And I just like what they say here, where they say US audiences aren't likely to leave the theater humming the Internationale or Trotsky's Red Army, but coming from the man who made shampoo, Reds is quite an accomplishment. I might disagree about the Internationale though, because it's so central to that scene that you might actually be humming it. Once we get past that montage, we get into some extraordinarily detailed politics like that review indicated. After leaving Russia, Reed works on building the Communist Party in the US. We get a lot of tense scenes where he's in conflict with the Socialist Party, who are the reformists who supported the war, and also in conflicts with his own party, mainly the immigrant trade unions, which are led by Luis Frena, who's played by Paul Sorvino from Goodfellas. There's a dramatic scene where Reed bum rushes the stage at the Socialist Party convention in Chicago in 1919, trying to appeal to the militants there, and he gets the cops called on him by the reformist leaders of the party. And you can really almost just imagine how this kind of thing would play exactly out the same way now, Okay, then he's sent by the Comintern. He's sent back to Russia as a delegate to the Comintern at the Second World Congress in 1920. I've already mentioned the conflicts he gets into with the leadership there and how he wavers, but ultimately decides to stick with the party. Then he's sent by the Comintern to the Congress of the Peoples of the East in Baku in Azerbaijan. And that was part of the Bolsheviks' campaign to bring the Muslim world into the revolutionary struggle. This is, let's see, there's the real Reed speaking in Baku. One thing that happens in Baku, he objects to a change that Zinoviev makes to a speech when he's translated into Arabic. They translate class war into jihad or holy war. And Reed is upset by this. He considers it demagoguery and not really true to Bolshevik ideals about propaganda. So again, he's in conflict with the party leadership. That's Zinoviev on the train away from Baku. And the way Beatty and his writers navigate all this is quite tricky, because on the one hand, they're risking playing into tropes about communism, such as suppression of free speech or demagoguery. And these are tropes that audiences in 1981 would have certainly bought into, and even now, But on the other hand, as this Workers' Vanguard piece argues, Reed fought doggedly and openly for his positions in the Comintern, a powerful indictment of its later bureaucratic destruction by Stalin. Only a few years later, heads would roll for far less. And to me, it's just remarkable that we're in this romantic period piece and we're discussing fine points about the Baku Conference of 1920 and the formation of the CPUSA. And you could imagine a lesser film about the romance between the two that left all this out, and it would be like an hour shorter and it would have made the same amount of money. So it's just that dedication that was just remarkable to me. The dramatic tension animating these final passages revolves around Reed's inner conflict between his life as an artist and husband and his obligation as a revolutionary. And at one point, Reed asks Zinoviev's permission to return to the US for Christmas. And Zinoviev tells him, no, the revolution is too important to leave, even for your family. And he says, you can never, never come back to this moment in history. And that just really speaks to what it takes out of you as a revolutionary. And the way Reds resolves that tension is breathtaking. Bryant and Reed come to realize that they are comrades as much as lovers. And it's really kind of the opposite of what you would expect from Hollywood, where individualism is everything. And in one of the best scenes of the film, Keaton argues with O'Neill, And O'Neill's mocking the revolution, and he's specifically mocking American radicals that support it. And she tells him, if you'd been to Russia, you'd never be cynical about anything again. You would have seen people transformed, ordinary people. And like if you took one of O'Neill's lines here about middle-class radicals, you could almost expect that to be a snappy comeback in another film, just like you might expect Goldman's anarchist defeatism would be central to another story. But it's the cynical individualist who's trumped by the argument for a collective politics and a worker state. And there's this great quote from the same Workers' Vanguard piece. The impetus for class struggle cannot be relegated to a romantic past, a lost American innocence. Reds is no mere nostalgia piece, or as one movie critic put it, radical chic antique. And this really reminded me of the discourse about Don't Look Up, the cynical critics versus the inspiration that you actually find on the screen. If simple expositions of class struggle politics sound strange to most Americans, it is not because of some increased sophistication in end-century America or the result of time and aging. Fundamental class counterpositions remain. It is the degeneration of the left, the result of massive defeats and betrayals of Stalinism, which have changed the terrain, the political terrain. What is needed now is exactly the sort of forthright class opposition shown by the early communist movement, and what they mean is shown in this movie as well. And I just think it's really cool that you can get that kind of inspiration from a film like this, which is also just so enjoyable to watch. That's it.